mentors that we've assigned to you. We try to have a general section where we bring things together just to make sure that there is this level of understanding and support that we give to everyone. And so today we have two amazing faculty members here at Cambridge who are going to be joining us in discussing, having this interaction, answering your question, looking at the entire application process in order to see how we can provide information that might be necessary to support you making your application. So the first person we have on the list is Dr. Alex Foss, who's happened to be a faculty in the Department of Chemistry. So he's here to kind of bring in the science perspective, because there's just going to be a slight difference across discipline and all of that, but the majority of the application process is going to be the same. And we have the second panelist, Dr. Glenn Rangwala, who happens to be a faculty member also in the Department of Politics and International Studies, same here at the University of Cambridge. And I myself am going to be the person moderating this particular event. I'm going to kind of asking them questions and then getting responses. And at the end, we are going to move to the audience to start taking questions from you. So I know the application is already open, so you might have started making your own application. Don't be in a hurry to submit. We are going to be answering questions about things that you might have encountered in the application process and all of that. And at the end, please feel free to bring in any question that you might have, which we might not have talked about. Okay, so this is just for you. This is an opportunity for you to ask about any question that you think might help you make a successful application going forward. So that's it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I just want this to be a kind of interactive section. It's not a presentation thing. We are going to interact, have a chat, and then people will listen and then contribute going forward. All right. Okay, so that is about that. So I think I will use this opportunity to invite Alex and Glenn to kind of introduce themselves so that we can begin the whole conversation. So Glenn, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Glenn Rangwala. I'm the non-chemist on the panel. I teach politics, but I teach for a number of different disciplines as well across the university, from history to literature to Asian and Middle Eastern studies. And I've been involved in admissions in a variety of different ways for graduate students, both master's students as well as postgraduate students. I'm often also on funding committees, so I was on the Gates funding committee for many years. So I've got quite a bit of experience as well in deciding not only what gets accepted for graduate work, but also what gets funded through the funding committee. So we can talk about all of that over the course of this session.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's amazing having you here on board, Glenn. Welcome. Alex, you want to go next?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. And so I'm Alex Force. I'm a lecturer in the chemistry department. I'm a relatively junior academic. I started about 2 years ago. And last year I was on the Department of Chemistry admissions panel. So I was helping with the interviewing and scoring of candidates. And I'll be very happy to try and sort of share as much insight as I can in this session.
Awesome. So basically, I have like 5 different broad areas of things I wanted us to look at, and we are going to try taking them one after the other. Just before we get started with those questions, some housekeeping rules. If you're not speaking, of course, please try to mute your mic so that you don't kind of interfere with the conversation. Time is going to come for you to kind of either speak directly asking your questions or pop your questions in the chat. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to kind of start looking at is what makes a strong application. So when you look at application with respect to the grammar, the style of writing, the technicality, the essay, there's so many essays that people are going to be writing. So we want to know, we're going to be looking at the application itself and then asking the question, what are the things that we need to consider? Maybe if you're a science student or you're making your application, the way you write your essay might not be the same way someone who is applying to some humanities and all of that. We have to write their own essay and answer some questions. Okay, so let's look at those nitty-gritty of what makes an application a very strong application, both in terms of the grammar, style, technical things, what to include in your application, what not to include in. Okay, so I don't know, anyone can actually take this up first.
Yeah. Should I begin? Is that okay? So firstly, for graduate work, there are 3 different types of graduate work that students do in Cambridge. One is taught masters programs, where you don't necessarily do any research yourself, but they are taught courses which span over usually the space of 1 year, from October through to June, and at the end you take exams of some sort. And those are what we call taught MPhils. Secondly, there are those which have a substantial component of a master's degree in which you do your own research. And that research can be half of it, or it can be the whole of the master's program. So we have some master's programs which are only by research and some which are 50% by research. And there you submit a research proposal, which is an important part of the application. The first, you don't submit a research proposal, the second you do. Those are usually in the arts and humanities assessed purely on paper. So we look at the application, we read the application carefully, often quite a few people read the application, and then make judgments about that application. The third form, of course, is the PhD. And there you have to submit a detailed research proposal. And a significant part of our assessment is about that research proposal that you're submitting to us. So we'll talk about a bit about each of those 3. But the PhD program often, in fact, almost always in the arts and humanities, is assessed not just through the paper application, but an interview as well. So we interview the candidates who apply to us, usually by Zoom, and it's usually quite a detailed interview. And so there's different things that are going on between the master's programs and the PhD in the assessment. For all 3, your prior exam marks, your prior university marks are important, or how you explain, how we understand your university marks. And I make that distinction because often when we get applications, we're not entirely sure what your marks mean. So it's important as part of your application that there is an explanation of what those marks correspond to, whether this means you're the top person in your year, or whether this means you're roughly in the top third, or in the top half, or not in the top half. It's important that somewhere in your application, if it's not obvious, that either your referee or you explain your marks to us. And so, and that has to be done seriously. It has to be often a very specific number. In this course, I came second out of 52 students. In this course, I was top of my year out of 12 students. That sort of type of information is really important to us in understanding what your marks mean. It's also important, I think, sometimes to explain your current university and what you do at your current university. So understanding whether this is a selective university is often important. So whether this is a university that's very seen as very significant in teaching the subject that you do, whether the university has specialisms in that subject, and then to what extent you've managed to focus on the subject that you are applying for within your previous degree program. So what I'm trying to get at is that it's important to understand the continuity between what you've been studying so far and how that's led you to develop certain interests which lead you into your master's application or your PhD program. So we were looking for you to explain what it is that you've done in your prior studies that lead on to the sorts of work that you'd like to do in future. And that becomes particularly important with research degrees, master's research degrees or PhD research. We want to know what sort of specialist knowledge you've already got in order for us to understand how you could go on to be a relatively independent researcher at the PhD level. At the master's level, it's not quite so independent. We give you lots of advice as a master's student, but it is a program in which we still expect students to have some prior knowledge of what it means to study that topic. You're not going to be new to that topic. You can't expect at a master's level to start from 0 and achieve a master's degree that's done by research in something you haven't studied before. So what we're looking for is an explanation of how you've got from where you are now to being able to be a good student on the master's program. And so that part of the explanation is also very important to have in your statement that you make to us. And that can be either the personal statement, if it is just a personal statement, but often you'll be submitting a research proposal as well if you're applying for a master's degree by research or a PhD. And there we do want that sort of detailed information of what it is you know at the moment and how you're developing your knowledge by going on to the research program. So that's the broad scope. And I think we'll come back to many of these topics over the course of this discussion, but that's the broad scope of thinking about what we're looking for when we see your proposal, when we're thinking about whether to shortlist you for a PhD or whether to accept you for a master's program. And so we'll come back to many of those topics, but that's the broad scheme of things.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Glenn. That was really a perfect summary of what the entire application process and then what is involved, really. So like you mentioned, we're going to start looking at stages, the career section, the entire application process, and then look at that. But before we do that, I wanted to, Alex, do you have anything to add to what Glenn has said?
Yeah, so if we think for a moment about the written application, so I'm not talking about the interview now, but in terms of the written application, to give you some perspectives from the science side, and really here I'm talking about courses with a significant research component. Some of the things that we'll be looking for, as Glenn mentioned, top grades is always something that we look for. We'll talk about if you're sort of on the border with your grades later on, I think. If you've got experience in a research lab, that should be something that is highlighted, and to try to connect that research experience that you've got and how that fits with what you want to do in Cambridge. If you do have any kind of research that's been published, it's really good to highlight that, because that's another thing that would strengthen your application. And then another thing that's worth highlighting, if you've been on an upward trajectory, so your grades have been improving, maybe you did a bachelor's and then only at the end of the bachelor's you really found your excitement for your subject, and then you did a master's. One thing we look for is for students that are on the up, and so their grades have gone up more recently. Yeah, I mentioned if you've got relevant skills to the research that you'd be doing, it's really good to highlight that in the application. So yeah, to give you an example, if you were applying to do chemical synthesis and you'd been working in a synthesis lab for the last year, it would be really good to highlight that and talk about possible skills that would help you hit the ground running and get off to a good start in your research. And the last bullet point I've got here on strong things is the references. I believe we'll also talk about that later as a separate discussion point. So I think we'll come back to that. But having strong references is important. And then just maybe I could mention a couple of things to avoid that I've sort of noted here. I think, David, you mentioned things like if you have bad grammar and bad English, that shouldn't be part of the assessment process, because really we're assessing your potential to come here and do research. But that said, it does leave a bit of a bad impression, either sort of consciously or unconsciously. So having if you're not an expert on English, it's good to have it to be proofread by someone who is, and it's a good idea to get it proofread anyway, in case of any mistakes. Another thing to avoid, I think this is the last point I want to make, is sort of general statements about Cambridge being an amazing place. I find those statements sometimes not very helpful. It doesn't really tell us anything about you. And I read a lot of these statements about, I want to go to Cambridge because, like, Cambridge is the best place, but it doesn't really tell us anything about you. It doesn't tell us about the fit. So I would try to make the comments more sort of specific to the course and the strengths of the department and how you fit in the department you're applying to. I think I'll stop there. That was a lot.
Yeah.
It is being recorded, so if I went too quickly, hopefully you can go back through it. Sorry.
David, would you mind if I jump in on one of Alex's
Yeah,
comments?
sure.
So one thing that I think you should be aware about in Cambridge is we make the assessment based upon what our assessment of your academic potential, the academic potential that you have. So we're looking for people who are strong scholars. That's our first and foremost judgment that we're making. And so your application, I think some people get the idea that they're meant to write sort of life biographies. They tell us stories about their childhood. They tell us stories about, how they got inspired in their subject and the things that they do outside of their studies. I think that is a very American system. I think a lot of American universities like to have a sort of a personal narrative sort of story. That really is not how we at Cambridge generally make these assessments. We make the assessment that's based upon our understanding of your ability to thrive on an academic program. And those sorts of stories might be nice to write, but they're not useful as part of the assessment process. They can be for scholarship programs. And so we'll come back to discussing how you get scholarships in a moment. But for the academic side of things, the statement that you make in your part of your academic application, we want to know how you can be a great scholar. So that's the focus.
Awesome. Thank you so much for chipping in that. And so I'm going to kind of go more specific. And the reason I'm doing this is that I have been opportune to kind of review applications of a whole lot of people. And I've seen a lot of mistakes and how people approach certain application questions and all of that. And so there are people who are just confused, that they don't know what is supposed to be at that particular section of the application thing. So I want to start with probably the first thing that people will have to struggle with or begin to think about how to present, which is the research experience. So there's going to be a place where you are asked about your research proposal. There's going to be a place about career goals and all of that. But I have seen that whether it's science or whether it's humanities, there is a section of the application that asks you about your previous research experience. So how do you think is the best way for students to present their previous research experience? How would they connect the dots? What if you are accessing a particular application and you are reading the research experience? What are you looking for? So Alex, do you want to start with this time?
Yeah, I was reflecting on this earlier and reading some old applications back, and one good one I found did the following. It told me about their experience. So what their experience was. It connected that experience to what they wanted to do in Cambridge. So it shouldn't read as a long list of all of the things you've done. Be selective and pull out relevant skills and relevant experiences that you've got that will look attractive to the prospective supervisors you're interested in. Another thing that I noticed that was very good in one I read earlier, the student had taken the initiative to secure some opportunities in different places, and I believe they had won a research grant to not a research grant, sorry, like a research placement, which was competitive, and they sort of slipped in that into the discussion, so you could see, okay, this person is good. They've taken the initiative to find these opportunities. They've got relevant experience, and so that was a good example. I probably missed some things there, but those were a few things that stood out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So Glenn, how does this apply in the humanities and social science?
So again, I just want to go back to the distinction I made earlier. There is a big difference here between applying for a PhD program and applying for a program in which there's a limited research component. For a PhD, we do want to know about your past research experience. That's an important part of it. And it can be relatively junior. It doesn't mean that you had to run your own research project, but maybe you helped somebody else. You're a research assistant for someone, or maybe you helped in the editing of a book that came out of research, or maybe you edited a journal article as part of a student journal that developed somebody's research, and you talked to them about it and got a sense of their work. So it doesn't need necessarily to be running your own research project, but we need to have some sense when we make an assessment of your application that you understand what running a research project is like. So think about the sorts of conversations, the sort of experiences you've had, and convey that as part of your application. Convey that knowledge of what it means to run research in the subject that you're doing as part of your application. For master's, sorry, just to say, for master's programs, we don't necessarily expect that sort of thing from master's programs. What we're looking there for is primarily an understanding of the subject. So you've read the literature, you know the sorts of things that have been written in existing academic articles about this subject. And there is an expectation that we will sort of teach you about doing research as part of the master's program. So we're not looking necessarily for high-level experience, even for a PhD, and we're not looking for research experience, particularly as a master's student, but we do want to have a sense that this is an interest that you've got into, that this is a subject that you've got to know quite well by reading relevant articles and books, and you reference them in your statement. You reference that you read these articles by these people and it got you thinking about this, and you thought actually you can make a contribution to this topic because you've got this perspective, which shows that the topic doesn't work in the way that those authors think it does. So you're showing how you can critically read the literature to give yourself the opportunity to contribute something to this field of study. Now, that may be ambitious, and it may not be that it doesn't quite work from our perspective, but what we're looking for is students who are thinking in those terms. Not necessarily students who've got all the answers straight away, but students who've been reading academic literature and thinking critically about what's in that academic literature and thinking about what they can do to help develop our understanding of a particular topic. So it's more dealing with that sort of ability to explain what you would like to do and plausibly like to do within a master's research project, which is more important at that stage, rather than I've got all this experience and let me tell you about it. But with a PhD, we do want some sort of personal experience that connects you with the research. So does that answer your question?
Yes. Gladly. Thank you so much for contributing that. I think before I move into the other parts of the essays and all of that, there is something that always pop up when candidates kind of approach me to talk about. In fact, last week, I was having a conversation with one of the mentees, and I was like, have you started the application? And he said, no. And I said, why? He said he's here to receive a response from his supervisor. I was like, you don't have to wait for a supervisor to, give you a response before you start that. Application opened on 1st September. You can decide to begin your application that day and submit on the deadline, actually. So I don't know if you can share your own perspective. What do you think is the role of supervisors in your success of in your academics in making successful application, which especially those, of course, it's not every course that requires a supervisor. So we need those ones that require a supervisor. Getting a supervisor before submitting and then not getting, how does all of that kind of affect your application? Glenn, you want to start with that this time?
Sure. I mean, I think you need to look carefully at what it says on the website for individual subjects. In my subject, and I think in most arts and humanities subjects, we do not expect you to get in touch with us before we receive your application, either at master's level or at PhD level. I get dozens of emails every week from students, and I cannot respond to them individually. I send back a standard response when I get messages like that, saying, please apply, and I'll look at your application if you apply. I cannot give a commitment to supervise somebody without seeing their full application, and that full application comes through the application process. So we'll get it in January in my department. We ask everybody to apply by early January. So if you apply in the subject that I'm interested in, which is politics, and I teach particularly a field of politics, Middle Eastern politics. If you apply in that subject and you've got good grades and the people on the shortlisting committee think it's worth seeing, then they'll send their application to me. And at that stage, I will read through the application in full. And there's no sort of preference to those who've been in touch with the supervisor or not beforehand. It has to get through, firstly, the shortlisting stage, which is done by a group of academics who read through the documents and see if your grades are good and see if it's a plausible research application, and then pass it on to the supervisor, who will then interview the student for a PhD program, or we'll make an assessment of whether the detail of the work makes sense from a master's perspective. Whether you've been in touch with us beforehand makes no difference at all, so there is no need to get in touch. However, I'm aware that some departments say slightly different things, especially smaller departments where they have very specialist programs. And in those cases, you might see it says on the website, you're advised to get in touch with the supervisor before you apply. But in the larger programs, that's generally not the case. So just look at the information on the website and don't spend lots of time sending emails to people if they just are waiting for you to see an application rather than personal contact.
Awesome. Alex, how does this work in chemistry and probably broadly in science?
Yeah, so I think I agree with everything that was just said broadly. So sometimes I get applications to work in my research group, and I've not had a discussion with the candidate in advance. They might have sent me an email, but perhaps I sent them a sort of standard email back, or maybe I didn't have time to reply even. But then if the application looks good, then they will be considered and they will potentially be shortlisted for interview. In chemistry, from my experience, the supervisors do play an important role in that when it comes to shortlisting for the interviews, I might have an application and imagine I'm the only prospective supervisor listed. Ultimately, I do have the final say on whether they progress to the interview or not. And so if it is a candidate that I've managed to have a chat with and we've kind of found some common ground already, that probably would give them an advantage, to be honest. And so to get to the interview in chemistry, from my understanding, you need a supervisor to put you in the running. That doesn't mean you need to already necessarily have had a lot of contact with them, but it might help. Is that clear?
Yes. I think that probably kind of extracts my understanding of how it works in chemistry as well. Now, there's this section of people I'm interested in kind of helping, clarify their doubts. Even for those departments that require supervisors, sometimes people don't get response. So, but they still have to put in the application, because just like both of you have mentioned, you look at the application, and if it's good, then you can talk about, progressing this person to the next stage. So when you are looking at application and you want to judge is good, what's the first thing you look at to judge that's good? Is it being in your field of something you are interested in, or what is the primary thing that you actually look at? Is it a research proposal and the kind of research that the student wants to do, or something?
Should I go on that one? So
yes,
in arts humanities departments, generally there is a shortlisting committee that receive all the applications, and they look at all of the applications that come in for the particular subject. It's not for them individually to supervise, but they're making an assessment about whether this looks like a plausible application. They will then pass the application to the relevant academic. So they will see that this person works on Middle Eastern politics, this applicant works on Middle Eastern politics, and they think it looks like a good application, so they will pass it to me to view. So at that stage, it's already with me, because I'm the relevant person in the eyes of the committee, who would be the best person to judge that application. So it doesn't matter if they mention me, it doesn't matter if they know anything about me, it doesn't matter if they've heard of me before, the application will still come to me to make an assessment. And I don't care if they know anything about me, I don't care if they know about the things that I write about or whatever. I make a judgment then about whether this is a plausible research proposal, and that judgment of plausibility, especially for PhD students, is, does this continue from previous work that you've done? So have you done a relevant master's course? Have you done a research project previously? For a master's student, it's, have you done undergraduate courses that actually make this look like a good topic to study at a higher level, at a master's level? And did you do well in those courses as an undergraduate? Are they the sorts of topics there that you've, in your research proposal, have got things to say which go beyond just the simple statements that you'll find in the basic literature? Have you thought about these topics in a more detailed way? What evidence is there that you've got the ability to perform highly at a master's level? Those sorts of questions are the key questions for me. And those can be gained partly from your transcript of marks from your existing university, but it's also important that it's explained in your own words. It's not just a set of numbers on a piece of paper saying that you got 86 for this course and 57 for that course and 91 for that course, but that you explain to us why it is that your prior experience leads to us thinking, us having confidence that you'll do well as a master's student at that level or a PhD student at the higher level. So I guess that's what I look for when the application comes to me as a prospective supervisor.
So Alex, how does it work with you? Because I think already we are discussing the next section, which is the proposed title. So what I understand from what Glenn has just explained now is that you just have to make sure that your research title, the topic, what you want to work with, there is someone in the department that is interested in that. Because if you have written something about going to the moon and there's nobody who is kind of interested in going to the moon in the department, probably nobody's going to kind of take your application going forward. So Alex, how does that actually work in chemistry?
Yeah, my experience in chemistry is it's good to mention specific supervisors, and that gives you a greater chance of getting picked up and sort of progressed to an interview stage. So yeah, I think it is important that you list at least one, maybe two supervisors that you want to work with and explain in your application why. So that's very much been my experience in chemistry, and I would imagine it would be similar in the other science subjects. So I think
is there a room, if for instance I have chosen 3 different supervisors and maybe my application was sent to these 3 people and they were not interested in supervising me, is there a possibility that someone who I have not listed could kind of come on board to supervise me?
Yeah, I think that is possible, definitely. It's just whether or not it happens. It's sort of relying on someone spotting a good application, which may or may not happen. Whereas if you've been named on the application, at least in chemistry, then you're specifically looking through all of those applications.
Okay. So I think Glenn has kind of answered a bit of this part when he was talking. So I wanted to gauge from you, Alex. This is with respect to a research statement of research interest and intended research topic. Glenn has mentioned a whole lot, try to distinguish what happens with PhD and masters, which are by research, and explaining how that differs from masters that are by thought. So for science and for chemistry, when you are looking at writing your statement of research interest, is there a way it differs from PhD and from MPhil students? Of course, I don't think chemistry has masters by thought. I think all our master is basically by research. So is there a way, what are the things that students should know when they are trying to write about statement of research, depending on whether they're going for masters or PhD?
Yeah, I think the things that Glenn said are relevant here too in chemistry. So for an MPhil, for example, you wouldn't necessarily expect anyone to have research experience. But as Glenn said, you would expect them to have perhaps read a few papers and at least started to think about research that they might want to do. For example, they might have read papers from some of the groups in the department that they're applying to. And then that might have inspired them to read some other papers, and then that starts to form a picture of something that they're interested in. So it's really, we're looking for similar things, but we expect less when a student is applying for a master's. We'd be looking much more at what is their potential to do research rather than have they actually already done some research.
Okay, I would have loved to talk about CV, but before we look at words or things that people should look at when presenting their CV and uploading that, let's talk a bit about career goals. So in a section of the application, there's a place where students are supposed to talk about career goals. So when students are writing this, what are you looking for in order to judge? Because Glenn mentioned you are looking for potential. Okay, so how do you read career goals? What do you want to see to show that the students have that potential to pursue a graduate study at Cambridge?
Maybe I can start. We were probably going to come to this later, but when we're assessing these applications, there is a sort of matrix by which we try to generate scores for each candidate. And to be completely honest, the career goals section doesn't really feature in that. So I would say this is avoid writing anything in the career goals that sounds sort of crazy or offensive. And if it's something reasonable, I think, you know, in chemistry, I would fully expect someone to write something about a career in chemistry. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean in research. It could be in industry, or it could be in education. But if they started talking about something completely off topic, I'd be a bit sort of bemused. So basically, don't worry about this section too much. Don't write anything crazy and off topic.
Awesome. Glenn, how does that apply to you?
I'm very glad Alex said it first. It's probably the least important section of the application from our perspective of viewing the candidates and evaluating the applications. I suppose it matters a little bit more at the PhD level, where we are thinking about, does this person want to go into an academic career? Or does this person want to go into government or civil service or international organisations? Those sorts of things. But that is really just a sort of the PhD students. It's more a point for discussion in the interview. So sometimes we'll pick up on themes that people write in that section in the interview with prospective PhD students. It's not generally part of the application, but it is also just sort of mapping out, you know, we're trying to also understand with PhD students, why is it they want to study this particular topic? What gives you the motivation for doing so? And with PhD students, that is often career related. So what they want to be doing in 5 years' time after the PhD is over, what they want to be doing in 10 years' time. So there it can be a point of conversation, but it's not the most relevant part of the application from our perspective of evaluating it. It can again be important for scholarships. And so again, we're going to come back to that in a moment with our discussion of bursaries and scholarships.
Yeah, sure. I think that also leads to, I didn't find this in a chemistry application, but I did find it in a politics about a reason for applying. Does this also fit in anywhere in the grading system? There's a section where students have been asked about reason for applying.
Okay, so again, there's a little bit of a difference here. With master's thesis, master's students, we don't necessarily expect a close correspondence between your interests and what goes on in the department at the moment. So for master's students, you could say that you're interested in studying the politics of my department, politics. You could say you're interested in studying the politics of a part of the world or a part of the country, which we don't have any particular expertise on in the department. And that's fine. Don't feel like you need to find somebody who matches your interests very closely with a master's thesis. So from a master's perspective, we're looking for students who've got a range of interests, who've got interests that they can develop within a master's course. And obviously it has to be about politics. Don't say you want to, your example, don't fly to the moon, but don't feel that you have to find people within the department who've got a close correspondence with your interests. With PhDs, it's a bit different. And so there, because you are working with a supervisor over the space of 3.5, 4 years in producing your work, it is, I think, important there to think about whether this in Cambridge is the department for you compared to all the other good politics departments around the world. And why is that? So why is it that Cambridge provides a good location to study the topic that you want to do? Why is it the supervisors that you see are relevant? Often also, what can you contribute to the department? So I think one theme that's often useful for PhD students, not so much master's students, but PhD students, is when they say to us what they would like to, develop within the department. So, a student who said that I've been previously involved in reading groups in my subject, and I'd like to join reading groups, but if there isn't a reading group in this subject, I'd like to set up a reading group in this subject. Or a student who said that I've been involved in, participating in conferences as an observer at academic conferences in my master's degree. I'd like to think about maybe getting a few other PhD students to help organise a conference in this subject. And I see on the department that you have funds there for students who want to organise conferences, and I'd like to be interested in doing that. And I think this would be a good addition to what you do at the moment. That often is a very valuable thing to do, so you're thinking about what we do at the moment and how you can add to what that department does. So think about it not just in terms of what's there at the moment, but also what you can add as an individual to the department by coming here.
Awesome. So I think just because of time, I'm going to move and talk about research proposal itself. We've briefly mentioned this when we started, but again, you've mentioned that the details you require from master students who supposing who are submitting a research proposal is going to be slightly different from the details you're expecting from someone who is running a PhD. And in fact, there might be some department that probably don't even ask a PhD student to submit a research proposal unless they are submitting, they want to apply for Gates scholarship. Because Gates will tell you under that section that if you're a PhD student, you need to, in addition to this, upload a research proposal if you have not already done so before. So when you're looking at research proposal, how do you expect the student to present this? What are the things you want them to bring in? Is there a need? This is something people have asked me often, because Gates, for instance, will tell you a research proposal should not be more than 2 pages. And people will say, okay, I have written a lot of things, but if I include references, it runs into the 3rd page. Is the reference supposed to be part of what I count? All of this. So I don't know if you could share based on your own experience or what you think it should be. How do you think a typical research proposal should look? What are the things that you bring on board? Alex, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I was just having a quick look at a previous application and trying to see, I couldn't see a box with research proposal, but is this for the scholarships, David?
Yes, exactly. So there are people that are not being asked about research proposal, but if they're applying for Gates Cambridge will say, if you're a PhD student, you must submit a research proposal in addition to other things, if you've not done that before.
Alex, I've been closely involved in Gates for many years, the Gates Foundation. I mean, have you had involvement yourself? Because
no, I haven't. So you might be better to start with this.
Maybe I should start actually, because I'm on the Gates committee in my subject in social sciences and humanities, and I talk all the time to the Gates people in the other subjects as well. So the first thing about Gates is that the application is sent to us by the department. So departments shortlist the students they think are relevant for the Gates Foundation, and they choose usually 2 applicants in each subject, which they then send on to the Gates committee. That's the department that does that. So it will choose people in the subject that they think are the strongest academically and have the highest potential and fit the great Gates criteria. The Gates have a set of criteria about demonstrating leadership, about bringing benefits to the world, about showing their ability to think about not just themselves, but about other people and their experience of working for a community or a wider community, however you understand it. Those are really important parts of the Gates application, the statement you make for Gates, which aren't really relevant usually for your academic application. So you can think about it in 2 ways. There's the academic application, in which you write a research proposal, which is often very long. In my department for a PhD student, we usually expect about 10 pages. So that's where you do the much more detailed work in explaining your topic, explaining your research experience, explaining why you were a good person to do that topic. And if we like that, if we think it's one of the applications that we think has got potential with Gates, then we'll shortlist it for the Gates process. So we do the assessment of the research at that stage and then forward it to Gates to look at. And then the Gates committee, of which I'm also part, then look at those things such as, does this person tick the other Gates boxes? Does this person show leadership potential? Does this person have a record of doing good things in their community? Those sorts of things. And then, so you're shortlisted again if you do tick those boxes. Now, at the Gates interviews, which I also do, at the Gates interviews, then we look at both the assessment of the department. The department will have written something about why they think this is a good student academically. So it will often say things about, the sorts of things that we think this student can do well, why this student's got particular skills, why this student's got a good record. And we'll often pick up on that in the interview. And we'll often also look at the other elements of your application. So how you demonstrate your leadership potential, how you demonstrate your community goods. And so we're often picking up on things that the department have told us, and we're also picking up on things that you've written. So it's not so much about that individual one statement, it's about the whole set of things that you've submitted to the department, you've submitted as part of your original application, often the interview you've had with the department as a PhD student, which we're also picking up on. So don't think that just because there's a separate form for the gates, a separate statement for the gates, that's all we get. No, we get a lot more. And so don't feel like you've got to pack in everything. And you were referencing fitting in your footnotes into the Gates application form. No, that's not part of it. We'll get that anyway as part of your departmental application. So the Gates statement, I think, has to be much more focused upon how you meet Gates criteria. And those Gates criteria are spelled out on the website in a way that I think is quite helpful. And we have to say, yes, this person meets these various different criteria in the Gates field, as well as meets the academic criteria that the department give us.
Awesome. Okay, so I think what I've just gotten from all of this is there are departments that we specifically ask students to submit research proposal, and there are departments that wouldn't do that. However, irrespective of whether your department is asking for that or not, once you're applying for the Gates Cambridge scholarship, you must submit a research proposal for the PhD candidates. For master's candidate, I don't think Gates is asking them for research proposal. I think he particularly mentioned that if it's a PhD there. Okay, so just because of time, I can see a question coming through, but I was going to discuss that, but let's leave that for the section side of things. Then let's move to ranking of candidates. So you guys have mentioned a whole lot of things, things you consider and things you don't consider. I'm not sure about admission, but when I was kind of trying to have this conversation with Jim Smith of Gates Cambridge and Helen Pennant from Cambridge Trust, especially Helen mentioned that they asked the department, I think Glenn has mentioned that, to rank students, maybe give them a number, I don't know how this ranking is being done. And then they probably consider this ranking and whatever additional thing that they have to do. So when you are ranking students, I would like to know, do you consider master students separately, PhDs separately, or all of them together? And what do you look at, and what are the things that you actually award scores to rank students?
Yeah, perhaps I was looking at this stuff earlier, I can try to comment.
Yes, sure.
Firstly, ultimately the master students and the PhD students are considered separately. So if you're applying for a PhD, you're not competing with people. If you're applying for a master's, you're not competing with people applying for PhDs. So I can speak most to the ranking for sort of research degrees, so MPhil research or PhD research. I think I've mentioned a lot of the points earlier. Just to say firstly, there's two areas where you get a score. You get a score on your academic application. This is out of 15, and you get a score on your potential, which is normally based on the interview, also out of 15. Okay, I know I'm giving you quite specific detail here. For the references, you're talking about a third of the marks out of the first 15. So the academic score, about 6 points, I think, go on the references. And then the remaining points, the remaining 9 points, basically go on things that I was already talking about earlier. So, for example, how good are your grades? Are you on an upward trajectory? Have you got relevant skills for what you'll be doing? If you do have any kind of publications, especially for PhD level, you might be awarded a point for that. But then there are other things. There is a little bit of I'm making it sound very much like a box ticking exercise, but it's not exactly that. So we'll also be looking, at things like, for example, have you got outstanding marks in a certain paper? So maybe you didn't do sort of as well as you wanted to overall, but you're brilliant at the area that you really care about. So you might get a point on that. There's also points available for if you've achieved a certain result, that you've actually had quite a poor opportunities available to you, or you may have had some health problems or some kind of external circumstances. That needs to be raised in the application, because that will be accounted for. Yeah, I think those are the first things. I guess for the interview, I think we might talk about that in another session, David. Is that right? But here we're talking about the first 15 points to the academic score.
Yes. Let's talk about, just because of time, we might skip that later on. So if you can talk about the interview now, it should be fine.
Sorry, you want me to talk about the interview?
Yes. The grading for the interview as well.
Yeah. Okay. So the interview is another 15 points. So then you end up with a score total out of 30. There's a few things we're looking at in the interview. So one thing is your potential. Well, overall, we're looking at your potential. One thing we're looking for is your knowledge of the field that you work in. So have you sort of done a bit of background research about your field that you've worked in before and that you want to work in the future? We're looking at things like, how do you actually think? So are you independent? Have you come up with ideas that you've developed yourself, or have you taken the initiative in the past to do certain things, to sort of come up with new research ideas, or to push a project forward? And then we're also looking at the sorts of technical skills and how your actual skill set matches with the research that you want to do. So your experience and your aptitude. I think that's what I wanted to say. Glenn, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, Glenn, please.
I was expecting chemistry to be very different from humanities, but actually, in this respect, it's quite similar. We are looking with the interview. We do press you. We do, ask you in quite detailed questions. You'll have mentioned a text in your research proposal, and we'll talk to you about, what was your interpretation of that text and how do you think it could be developed. So we'll often ask you quite detailed questions about things that you've sent us. One of my pieces of advice for you, I mean, everything Alex has said is true, but one thing that I generally think is advisable to do, if you don't know, if you can't talk about a topic, don't pretend you can. Tell us if you don't know. So often we'll ask you questions about methods. You want to use this method, well, tell us about the detail about this method. You can't guess the answer to that. Don't try and guess. Just say, I'd like to find out more about it. I understand you've got a course on that topic that first year PhD students can take, and I'd be interested in taking that course. That's a much better way to go about addressing questions that you don't know the answer to. Explain how you will find out about it. Don't try and give answers to things that you can't actually speak to. Sometimes the questions can be quite sort of, you've said you want to work on this topic. Have you read these texts by this author who's recently written this book about this topic? And if you haven't, don't try and pretend you have. Or if you've only read, you've only heard about it but haven't read it, it's fine to say that. You say, this sounds like an interesting text. It sounds like it could work with my work. It could fit with my work, and I've been really interested to reading that in my first term as a PhD student. That's a much better answer than pretending you know something you don't know. So interviews are also about knowing. Sorry, just to say, interviews are also about knowing whether you know the limits of your knowledge. If you see what I mean. So yes. we don't expect everybody to know everything. We don't expect anybody to know everything, but we do want you to know what you know and what you don't know. And that's an important part of also what we try to determine with an interview.
So if I'm correct, before the grading, the ranking is done and sent for funding, you must have conducted the interviews, right?
For PhD students, yes. Not for master's students.
Okay, I see. Awesome. Okay, so there is, Alex, you did mention that more than a third of the score you give for academic performance, the 15, goes to references. And this is something that I think is problematic especially for people coming from Africa. There are a whole lot of people, you just ask them to write a reference because Cambridge usually send a link to them. You don't even know what they've written. Some people just, use some templated reference and write all of that. So I wanted to, in your own view, what are the things that you think you are looking out for in a reference? Is there a way you collaborate what has been written in a reference with what the student has said somewhere in the application? And what in your opinion do you think is the best way for students to approach who they ask to write a reference for them? Alex, you want to say? Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing I would say, I don't know, David, do you know if there's a suggested number of references? Because one thing
Yes. Yes, so if you are not applying for GATE, there is just 2 references. But if you are applying for GATE, then there is a 3rd reference, which is a personal reference, actually.
Okay, thank you. Sometimes I've noticed there'll be 3 or 4 references in some cases. I think you can include more. I would just say only include the people that are really able to champion you, the people that have supported you and the people that really believe in you. Because I think sometimes people think they need more references and that's better. Actually, just a couple of good ones is what you're looking for here. So pick people that really believe in you and that have supported you properly in the past, as far as possible. Now, let's see. The references are an important part of the application. I think we want to know the reference's opinion of your academic ability and your potential, as well as your sort of independence and the initiative that you've taken in the past. So those are some of the things that we're looking for. So yeah, I think those are my first thoughts. Also, just one other one actually. I mentioned earlier sort of achieving results potentially in adversity. So if you had a health problem, or if there's a part of your application that maybe doesn't look very good, for example, a low grade or something, the reference is another quite good place to explain that. So you could ask your reference, or can you just comment on that I had this problem and say that particular exam didn't go so well, because that can be really helpful, and that comes quite well from the reference sometimes, rather than just coming from you.
Awesome. Glenn, how does this apply to you?
Alex's points are all very helpful. Just a couple of other things that you might want to suggest to the referee that they add. Sometimes it's useful to explain a bit about the university itself, especially if it's not a university which has an amazing international reputation already. So just for the reference to say that this is one of the top universities in the country, or that this is a university which has a particular specialism in this topic, which is also the topic of the student, and that is, and to say something about, the faculty in which the student has been studying and the quality of that faculty. I think even if it's just a couple of sentences is often very useful. So we know that this is a good program that the student is coming out of if they're going to do a master's or a PhD here in Cambridge. So a little bit about that is useful. I also want to just come back to the point I made right at the start about ranking. So I think, and it sounds brutal, but just for a reference to say that this, on my course there were 52 students, and this student got the second best mark, is really helpful information for us. And it's really, and just to say they did well, they got a mark of 86, doesn't really help us very much. To be able to give us that sort of ranking order that comes from something like exam marks or essay marks really does give us a sense that, yes, this is one of the top performing students in their cohort. And yes, therefore, that makes a difference to our ability to have confidence. They'll be a good student here in Cambridge too. And it doesn't need to be across the board, but in the particular course that's relevant. So, you'd want a referee who's writing about the sorts of topics that you are also thinking about doing your master's or your PhD in. So if they can say that in my course, they may not have got the top marks overall across the whole year, but in this course, that's particularly important for the program you've applied for, they did really well. That is really important information, which referees often need to be encouraged a bit to write, but writing it really does help your application.
And that just links back to what I was saying about be tactical when you choose your references. So if you did really do very well in the course, try to approach the person that led that course, and they'll be able to say how great you are.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think that would bring me to, I know we've talked about in between about funding and the things, the ranking and all of that, but I wanted us to use this opportunity to address anything that we've not talked about. The reason is that I could remember in 2018, that was when I was trying to launch a foundation that supports students like this, the Africa for Our Dream initiative. Then I was the international officer of the Graduates Union. I had a meeting with the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Education, Graham. And then I was pushing for access program for minority students. So I had this meeting telling him that I was looking at the ways Cambridge can actually give more admission, more opportunity to people from less privileged background and all of that, people from Africa, people from all these emerging markets and all of that. Then he told me, because I was thinking there is this quota system where Cambridge says, okay, we are going to admit 20 people and the 10 of them are going to be from UK and the other 10 is going to be international. You know, that was my thought. Then Graham told me that there is no such thing, that anyone who qualifies to actually come to this place will usually be given an opportunity to do that. But once that conversation progressed, we realized that because he approached, he kind of made a call across the admission office and then was asking about some data. And then we realized that there are a whole lot of people who actually get admitted to Cambridge, but they don't take up that offer. So, and most of them didn't get funding. So you can see that funding is a huge impediment to the determination of whether someone actually comes here to do a PhD or something like that. So I would like you to use a couple of minutes to say, what are the things, how do you think these students should make their application stand out to remain competitive for funding?
So things have changed quite a lot in Cambridge in funding over recent years. It used to be the case when I was a PhD student, you used to send your own application to lots of different organisations which could fund you. So you'd send an application to the Research Council, you'd send an application to a private organisation, send an application to a college. Now it's all done through one route. So you put your application in, and your department then chooses who to forward your application to, whether it puts you forward for Gates, whether it puts you forward for a research council funding, whether it puts you forward for college funding. That's done at the department level. And that's a really much more efficient way to do things rather than you as an applicant putting in your application to lots of different institutions at the same time. So I think it's a bit more efficient. It does mean that there's one body that makes all the decisions, which is your department. It decides whether to rank you highly or not. So it's much more centralized in that way. But it does mean that, you know, you're not waiting around for lots of different replies. You'll get one set of replies. We put you forward for, we've decided to make you an offer, and we've put your application forward to this funding institution to consider funding you. Many departments also have a number of reserve funding places. My department funds usually 2 or 3 PhD students per year directly. So we put forward the applications that we like best, we think most highly of, to the different funding institutions. And usually we'll be successful in most of those cases, but not all of those cases. And so we have this funding that even though you didn't get the funding with that institution, we therefore are going to choose you as 1 or 2 of the departmentally funded people who will accept onto the PhD program this year and give you funding directly. So we think it's a more efficient way to do it. And it also means that you're not waiting around for lots of different people to reply to you. And I think in that sense, at least, it also makes it more simple to understand, I think, for PhD students who don't have experience previously of Cambridge University or other universities like that. So I do think it has become simpler, even in the time since you spoke to Graham Virgo, David. I think it has become a bit more simple and more straightforward in the decision-making stage with funding.
Awesome. So how do you think students should better position their application in order to become competitive for those funding? Because like you mentioned, you need to look at this application and ask yourself, okay, which one will stand a chance? So how would I, as a candidate who's trying to put in my application, make sure that my application stand a chance to be selected for all of this funding that you've mentioned?
In most cases, that is what we've been discussing. I mean, Alex has made the points very well about on the sciences side, about how you actually show you understand the topic. And we've also been talking about interviews. And so for us, with PhD students especially, a lot will then depend upon the interview itself. Alex mentioned that, you know, 1/3 of the marks come from the interview. And that's actually very important because everybody who's being given a place has ranked highly on the references and ranked highly on the academic potential. the interview is often the deciding factor then about who you decide to put forward for funding. You know, some people are very good on paper, but not so good when you actually ask them to explain their topic. And so thinking about how you explain your topic, how you interview well, and we've been talking about that again, but how you interview well then becomes the key decision between just getting an offer of a place and getting an offer of a place with funding, which of course is so important.
So is it right for me to think that there are two ways that your chances of getting funding can be maximized, or two considerations? The first is the ranking that the department does to move your name to those funding bodies. And then the second, in addition to that ranking, is whatever it is that the funding body now look into. For instance, if you were to be Gates Scholarship, they look into your personal statement and all of that before they now make the final decision.
That's right. So a lot of funding bodies have their own criteria. And Gates is the most obvious one, where we've been talking about leadership and all of that sort of type of thing as part of what they do. And that's where they ask you for a separate statement for Gates, because then you can explain those sorts of things in that statement.
So the departmental ranking focus solely on those academic things that Alex mentioned, those 30 marks, those academic parts and the interview. All right, awesome. Okay,
I mean, obviously we think about who would be a successful. I mean, obviously we want our students to be successful in getting funding. So we think who would be likely to appeal to Gates. Who would be most likely to get successfully funding from the Gates institution too. So at the department level, we also are a bit strategic in who we put forward for Gates, who we put forward to research councils, who we put forward for other funds that we know about.
Exactly.
So there is a bit of calculation there, but of course we only would do it if you are among the top students that we rank in any one year.
Academically, okay. So first you need to pass the hurdle of your academic excellence, and then you'll be considered for this other bit of what the various funding bodies are looking for. Okay, I think that is clear. Thank you so much. I think I can start taking questions well, because maybe we have less than 15 minutes or thereabout. I can start reading questions from the chat. The first one, this is something I just purposely skipped it because I saw someone asked it here. There's a section of the application that's where you are required to include additional information, some additional information section. Again, what kind of thing would you think is best to put in there, and how useful is even this section?
I guess this could be a one possible place to just declare anything that would be helpful for people reviewing the application to know. For example, like I talked about, if you'd had some health problems, I think that could be a place. Anything that you want the assessors to know, but you didn't have an obvious place to put it, I think that's what should go there.
Okay, that's exactly right. So it's for things you don't have a chance to put elsewhere. If you don't have anything to add, don't fill it up with just words for the sake of writing some extra words. There was one question which I just want to connect to this. Somebody's asked about how about it if you did some research on a topic, but then you changed your interests and your interests are now something else. That's a really good sort of thing to put in the additional information section. That originally I was working in this field, but I realized that I couldn't carry on for these reasons. Or actually, it also led me to being interested in this other topic. And although I've got some methods and some skills I've learned through doing research in this other topic, I now want to use it for this topic. And that's a really good thing to put in the additional information section to explain why it is that you've done research in this before, but now you want to research on that in future. So that's exactly the sort of thing that additional information is, the section is there for.
Okay, awesome. So there's this other question. I think basically the core of the question is the person is kind of worried how Gates kind of chooses who they choose. So because some people will tell you that Gates scholarship usually favor more of science students than it would for humanities and all of that. And I think that's what this person is asking. But before then, he's asked in terms of conceptualizing leadership potential. I'm always a little uncertain as to what that would entail in the field like MPhil in English studies, which is majorly individualistic. So another question is whether the humanities are considered as often as other fields for the Gates application. You're mute.
What we do, what we do with GATES is split you in 4 different groups. There are the biological sciences, the physical sciences, the humanities, and the social sciences. And we each give roughly equal numbers of scholarships each year. So it's the same for each of those 4 different categories. We each give about 13 bursaries per year to new PhD students for each of those 4 different groups. For the international round, the US round is separate, but it's roughly the same. So yes, my department actually happens to be the most successful department with students getting GATES funding. Polis has more GATES scholars than any other department in the university. So I can confidently say it's not just scientists, it's also people in the humanities and social sciences. What we understand by leadership differs by subject, and we deliberately say leadership understood in very general terms. That can be if you're in a social science, but you've worked in a charitable sector, for example, you've worked as a volunteer, that sort of type of thing. It can show that you've taken the initiative. In others, it can be much more intellectual initiative, that you've done something that, you've gone to an archive, or you've interviewed somebody, or you've found a set of literatures which were not prescribed to you by anybody, but because you were interested in them. That itself is understood as a form of leadership potential, because you took the initiative for yourself. You found a way to make this work. Often it can be about your background. So, for example, if you came from a disadvantaged background, but that you managed to get funding for your undergraduate degree, you managed to find someone who was willing to sponsor your undergraduate degree, that can also show leadership potential. That's not part of the academic evaluation, but it is part of the GATES evaluation. So when GATES are making decisions about funding, we're also looking at the ways in which you show that you have used not just what people have given you, but that you've used your own initiative to find out how to be a good scholar and how to develop your own career. So that's part of the leadership potential category with GATES.
Awesome. Then I think the next question we can take on, maybe Alex, you can comment on this with respect to publication. So we did mention that if you have publication, that could be an added advantage for you, but then the person is now worried about where this publication has been made. Is it a low ranking publication, or is it a high ranking journal article? Do you consider all of that, or is the point the fact that the person has made publication that is you are just looking at?
It's a good question. So I think what we would be looking for is that it would be a peer-reviewed journal. So the work has been reviewed by experts before publication. I believe when these sorts of things are looked at purely on the scoring matrix, I think any kind of peer-reviewed publication will gain you some credit there. When I'm reviewing the applications personally, if I notice, oh, they've published in this journal that I sometimes read, that might look particularly impressive to me, and I might get quite excited. In terms of the actual scoring, it might not be important.
Could I just add, for the arts and humanities, it's very rare. We don't expect you to have published in a journal before you apply to be a PhD student. I mean, that's not part of our general expectation. Obviously, if you have, great, but it doesn't actually add that much, especially if it's not a particularly advanced piece you published. So I wouldn't go out of your way to produce something in publication just because of the application process. Much better to refine your research topic and write a good research proposal than to spend time publishing something which isn't necessarily particularly strong.
And also to provide some reassurance as well, I've accepted students at the master's and the PhD level who haven't published before. So it's certainly not a prerequisite.
Awesome. So I think, Glenn, you did touch about this next question when you were talking about what you can include on an additional information part. But again, if you can spend a couple of seconds or thereabout to maybe buttress more on this, the person is asking if you've got a different research experience A, but you're interested in a course which is B at Cambridge. How do you kind of link all these things together to make sure that, okay, you've explain how that can actually help you to pursue whatever graduate program you're running here in Cambridge?
I mean, I think it is thinking about what skills you learned from doing something else, which then you could think about as being useful for what you're going to go on to do. So it's not so much about the topic being the same, but about sort of what you learned about how to go about, researching a topic, how you went about learning how to organize yourself, how to go about organizing funding, for example, and what sorts of things did you gain from doing that, which then enable you to do it better when you switch topic at a later stage. So I think it's useful. It's not key, but it's the sort of thing that in the additional information section can help us understand why it is that you've got something that you did before, but now you're doing something else as part of your application now. I should say for humanities subjects, it is quite common to do that. It is quite common that you did a first degree where you specialised in one thing, and then you changed tack at your master's level, and then you're applying for a PhD in something that's sort of a bit different from both of those two. That isn't uncommon, and it isn't necessarily a disadvantage. But what we do want is some explanation of how you've got to where you are now, and what you've learned along the way, along the winding path to where you've decided to make your application. So we do want to explain to us, even if it isn't a straight path from from starting university all the way through to a PhD application.
Awesome. Alex, how does this play a role in chemistry when you try to read what someone has explained as a research experience, and this is different from what the person is trying to apply to? What do you consider to make a decision about this kind of people?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Glenn said. I think it's fine to change your interests, and I think it should just be explained in the application, and sort of why did you change, and why are you excited about this new topic now? Is there actually any connections between them that might be beneficial? And if so, then those could be pointed out.
Okay. And again, just to add to this, if it's any consolation to the person who's asked this question, before coming to Cambridge to do my PhD, I used to be an experimentalist. I never had any background in theory, coding, or what have you, but I was able to have a chat with my supervisor and convince him how the past research experience I have connects to what I want to do. I don't have any theoretical background. I have experimental background, but I was able to tell him the problem that I wanted to use theory to kind of solve, and how my past experience relates to that. So that's a typical example of what Alex and Glenn has been trying to say.
That's an excellent example.
Yeah. Okay, so I think the next question, even though I know the obvious answer, but I'm going to leave Alex and Glenn to answer this. Someone is complaining that the character section, the number of characters they are given, is too short to explain what they want to write. And they're asking if they can send additional information, maybe via email, or upload it somewhere. So yeah, what do you have to do?
So yeah, don't send any additional documents, I would say. It's not fair to do so, and they won't be considered. So you just have to be concise. And when I do these things, try to make a few specific points. What are the main points you want to get across, and then construct that into the answer.
Okay, awesome. I think just because of time, we have 8 minutes to go. I'm going to run through the other questions. There's this other question. I think people are kind of worried that a university like Cambridge will have to start looking at the person who is applying. Are you applying from Harvard? Did you do your undergrad at MIT? Did you do it somewhere in Nigeria, in South Africa, and all of that? So when you are ranking application, what role does the school that the person is coming from play in deciding what rank you give to this application?
It does matter. It does matter. You can't ignore the fact that some universities will have more rigorous master's programs than others, and will have higher quality teaching. So that does make a difference. That's why I made the point about how important it is often for a referee to explain in the reference why it is that this university that you're at is actually a good university in that subject. So, it may not be Harvard or MIT, but it's, the best or one of the best universities in your country in which that subject is taught. I think that's the sort of information that we do want to know. And it's different for masters and PhDs. It matters more at PhD level than master's level, but still it's important either way to convey that you have taken courses that are serious scholarly courses in the subject that you're taking. So both in your application, but probably more importantly in the references, it's important for that information to be conveyed.
Okay, so Alex, do you have anything to chip in with regards to that?
Yeah, this is Safenmi's question, is it?
Yes.
I think Safenmi might be asking about the sort of how can referees actually rank students if there's not a rank given to the student in the class. I think what they'll have to do, there'll probably actually be an explicit sort of question asking, what is your estimation of this student? Are they in the top 5% of the class, or are they the top 10% of the class, and so on? And so they will form an assessment. And of course, that is very subjective sometimes. So it's about choosing people that, again, who you think are your champions and really see your potential.
The Cambridge application asks you to give evidence, the referee to give evidence. So if you say they're the best out of 1,000, you have to be able to provide some evidence for it, or it'll just look like nonsense. It will just look like you're exaggerating as a reference if you say that without any evidence. So that evidence can be all sorts of different things. It can be that I marked the exams this year and that this person got the best mark in the exam. Or that I know that even though it wasn't formal information, that this student did the best across 3 different courses, or they have the average highest aggregate mark out of the 3 courses. But that information needs to be given to us. It can't just be assumed that because a referee writes first out of 30, that information is valid. The reference needs to be able to show that in what they write in the reference. And I think it's just important to convey that. I mean, it does say so on the website already. It says in the information for referees, you need to be able to provide evidence. But hearing it from you as well, I think can be just helpful additional information for the reference to be written in a way that's effective.
So I think I can take this one question and then we can wrap it up. Because it ties neatly with one of the questions I've left out, which is something about someone having fallen on the lower cadre of the grade. Because averagely, Cambridge will tell you that the minimum requirement for you to come here is say 2-1, but some department will straightly tell you, okay, no, you have to be first class. Some people have actually emailed me to say something like computer science will tell you, you have to have made first class at your undergraduate level before you can apply. But there's some people have actually reached out to me to personally ask, and they will say, I want to do a PhD at Cambridge, but my undergrad was a 2-1, but my master's was a distinction. What do you think is going to be considered? Do you think my undergrad is going to affect me, or do you think that my master's is going to help boost my chances? I know partly Alex has actually answered part of this when he said, we want to see your final class, exactly. We want to see your progression. We want to see that you are moving up. But maybe if you can buttress more on that and then tie that neatly into those people who think that they are on 2-1, they are not first class materials, but they still want to come here and do a graduate program. Is there something you think that such a person can do to actually up their chances of coming to Cambridge?
Alex, do you want to go first? Or...
Yeah, so I talked about the upward trajectory and you just commented on that. That's important. And I think, yeah, maybe you've got a 2-1 overall, but you had particularly outstanding marks in some particular area that you're excited about that's relevant to what you want to do in Cambridge. That should be highlighted somewhere in the application. And as I mentioned earlier, you might have got a 2-1, but there may have been sort of some external factors that led to that, and that needs to be explained in the application as well. Because a 2-1 is a very good grade, and if you had some sort of something going on in your life at the time, it may be an even more impressive grade if that context is given. Yes, I think those are some of my comments. There is obviously a minimum application grade which you can check on the website, but I'm assuming that we're already past that point.
Yeah.
Just to add to Alex's point, I mean, Alex's point is entirely valid, that you've got to stress what you did best in your degree program, and show why that's relevant to what you're applying for. Also, the other things you've done also matter. So other research experience that you've had, again, this is also there in the question that was asked. Things that you've done between getting your grades and applying also matter for us. And the longer ago your degree was, the less it matters to us. So you might have got a 2-1, but that was in 2005, and it's been a long time since then, and you've done lots of interesting things since then, and that therefore, at least, the grade matters less to us because we're more interested in what you've done, you know, since then, rather than what you did a long time ago with your degree. So so I guess just stressing what you've done well and what you've done that most recently you've done well, it can matter more than just the class mark that you've got.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we are just on the spot, 8 p.m. I think we can wrap it up now, but I'm going to give Glenn and Alex the last opportunity to just briefly give a closing remark. What are your message to these students who are kind of fighting tooth and nail to come to a place like this? Anyone can go first.
Okay, well, you've just thrown that one at us without any warning. Okay, so let me just say, I mean, the one thing that I think can, you know, which really does make a difference to applications at the PhD level is your research proposal. You know, to really get that right, to spend time on it, to think about what the relevant literatures are, to think about what you've got to say particularly about this subject, and to do so in a way that, you know, is engaging to read, that makes us think, yes, this is somebody who's really good, can do something with this topic. They may not have got perfect grades beforehand. One of their references might be not particularly helpful, but that this is a person who's got a real motivation for this subject and really understands it well, and therefore has got something new to say about it, I think is the sort of thing that can move somebody from being a borderline case to being an accepted case.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Glenn. Alex?
Yeah, I think maybe a closing thought from me is think about the fit. So you're excited about something. There's exciting work going on in Cambridge. How do those things fit together? And so how will you bring your passion and then contribute to an area? I'm talking about research here, and contribute to an area of research. How do those things connect together?
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's been a very interactive and eye-opening moment. I've actually learned a whole lot of things which I can actually use to support my own mentees. So thank you so much for joining. And to our mentees who've joined us, please, we've sent the link to the YouTube link for this particular program. So later on, go back, pause, replay section by section, and then hear the things that we've said and put in your own best in trying to make it. Just believe in yourself. Don't be pessimistic. Don't give up even before you started. The best way to fail, they will usually say, is not to try in the first place. And yeah, I wish you guys the best of luck with the application and everything going forward. And I hope by next year, I'll be able to see some of you here in Cambridge. Maybe we can have a pint of beer at one of the pubs, you know. Can never tell. So thank you guys, and goodbye. See you.
Thank you all so much for the questions.
Thank you.